Can you hear us, Commissioner Fielder?
Yes, I am good to go. Thank you.
Right. Well, we'll get back on the record then and reconvene. Northwestern, your next witness.
Thank you, Chairman O'Donnell. Northwestern will call Mr. Michael Bobineau. And I believe he needs to be sworn in.
Yes. So, Mr. Bobineau, would you raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may proceed.
Mr. Bobineau, can you please state and spell your name for the record, please?
Michael Bobineau. Last name is spelled Babineaux.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy,
And what's your title?
Senior Analyst with Energy Supply Planning.
Do you have your pre-filed direct testimony in front of you?
I do.
Do you have any corrections to that?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today as are presented in that testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to enter Mr. Bobineau's testimony and exhibits in as Northwestern 3, I believe.
Objections?
No objection.
So ordered.
And for clarity of the record, when I previously introduced Northwestern Exhibit 1 and 2, or the testimony says 1 and 2, that included exhibits, and I confirmed with staff and opposing counsels.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson?
Sorry, I'd like to open my witness up to cross.
Oh, okay. All right. You just stop. Oh, we have a video issue here.
Commissioner Fielder, can you hear us?
I can hear you, but I can't see you. But I'm not sure that seeing really matters at this point if we're not screen sharing.
Okay, then we'll be back on the record now. Where were we? Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Babineau.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
Am I correct that the focus of your testimony is providing the commission with an estimate of the cost of capacity, the avoided cost of capacity based on the use of a proxy resource, which you identify as a 50 megawatt aeroderivative unit at the Dave Gates generating station. Is that correct?
That's close. I would say it's in providing the cost of capacity, not the avoided cost.
But the point of providing the cost of capacity is to calculate an avoided cost for capacity, right?
Correct.
I want to start. Well, let me also preface this. We have a couple of layers of disagreements between the parties. We have a disagreement. Would you agree with me about what is the appropriate proxy resource to use, whether it's a unit at Dave Gates or a potential unit at Yellowstone, right?
Sorry, I would agree.
And then there's also various disputes about once you pick a proxy resource, how do you calculate what the cost is of that capacity, right?
Yes, I agree.
As we look, though, as between the two different proxies, would you agree with me that the capital costs of the Yellowstone County Generating Station are known with a relatively high degree of certainty because those costs are the subject of a negotiated and binding construction contract between Northwestern and your contractor to build it, right?
Objections outside the scope of his testimony. Mr. Bobineau doesn't say anything about the Yellowstone County Generating Station.
So I'll sustain that.
Relative to the Dave Gates generating station, let me back up. Your cost estimates are based on an analysis done by HDR Engineering as part of the 2019 Electricity Supply Resource Procurement Plan, correct?
That's correct.
That estimate was not incorporated into a negotiated and binding contract to construct a new 50 megawatt unit at Dave Gates, was it?
That's my understanding, yes.
That cost estimate was also prepared in 2019 or sometime before then. Is that correct?
That's correct.
you know exactly when that cost estimate was prepared?
I do not exactly.
That cost estimate, however, was prepared prior to the COVID pandemic. Fair?
I think that's fair.
Do you agree with me that the COVID pandemic had a significant impact on the costs of large construction projects like power plants?
Objections outside of his testimony. He doesn't say anything about the COVID pandemic or how it would affect costs.
This witness testifies on what it would cost to build a new 50 megawatt plant at Dave Gates. And I think the impacts of COVID are relevant to that.
This witness provides a calculation based on costs that were part of a resource that was identified in a plan. It's fair to say those costs were before the pandemic, but to ask him how the pandemic has affected costs is completely outside of his testimony.
I'll overrule that.
You recall the question, Mr. Babineau?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I can try. Would you agree with me that the cost estimate upon which you rely in this case was developed prior to the COVID pandemic occurring?
Yes,
Do you further agree with me that the COVID pandemic had an effect, large effect, on the cost of constructing large projects such as new power plants?
it's my understanding that it has had an impact on construction costs.
Your analysis does not attempt to capture that effect, does it?
In terms of inflation, I believe we made an adjustment from what we have used previously to try to capture some component of that increase.
Okay, and I appreciate you have an inflation adjustment, but as a general principle, I am correct, am I not, that your analysis does not consider or analyze whether the effects of COVID and the pandemic would have had an effect on the estimate of what it would cost today instead of pre the pandemic to build the proposed proxy power plant, right?
I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Well, let me try it this way. There's nothing in your testimony that suggests you considered whether the pandemic would have had an effect on the estimates you provide, correct?
Other than that change in inflation rate, which is trying to capture some of that, I would agree. We do not explicitly attempt to make an adjustment to costs.
Which do you think the commission should place more faith in? A construction cost quote that is incorporated into a binding and negotiated contract to construct a project, or a construction cost estimate developed for a hypothetical project that was never actually put to contract?
The short answer is I would say it depends, but in this case, since we're talking about QFs, we have a procedure that we go through, and as well as with planning, that we look at least cost resources. And in this regard, we're looking at a least cost resource that can provide capacity.
I'm gonna focus on your first part of your answer, that depends. What are the circumstances under which you would place more faith in the accuracy of a construction cost estimate for a hypothetical project as compared to a construction cost quote incorporated into a negotiated and binding contract?
I suppose if I were building that particular project, then having the exact cost from the person building it would be better than a quote that was done prior by that same person or others.
What?
If I were building that project.
Sorry. Does that conclude your
That
answer?
concludes my answer.
Okay, very good. What do you think is more likely to take into account any impacts that COVID has had on construction costs? A hypothetical engineering estimate done in or before 2019, or a contract to construct a project executed in 2021?
Well, I guess I would think that you would have more information with more recent data. We would, anybody doing that would have to speculate, I would think, to some degree about what are the long-term effects of COVID.
Your calculation of the avoided, excuse me, your calculation of the capacity cost of the proxy resource does not include costs associated with a backup fuel system, correct?
That's correct.
If the commission were to determine that it was appropriate for purposes of this case to include the cost of a backup fuel system, that cost would have to be added to your estimate presented in your testimony, correct?
Some form or fashion, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Babineau. That's all the questions I have for this witness.
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Hamilton,
No questions for this witness.
Commissioner Fielder,
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Commissioner Brown,
Mr. Chairman, no questions for this witness.
and I have no questions. Right?
Just a couple questions.
Sure.
Mr. Bobineau, does Northwestern follow least cost planning principles for purposes of calculating avoided costs?
Object to that question is beyond the scope of the witness testimony. I was trying to explore avoided cost for this witness, and I was told that was beyond the scope of his testimony. So if it's beyond the scope of his testimony for me, it should be for Mr. Hensley as well.
His testimony picks a resource from our 2019 resource plan that follows the least cost principles. That's exactly what within his testimony.
So you're asking him if he agrees with what you just said?
Yeah, I'm asking if Northwestern follows least cost planning principles for determining avoided costs.
And you just said that it did. So I guess
I'm not the witness in the record, so in order for it to be actual evidence, I would need my witness to say that.
So let me rule against Mr. Nelson right here. You may proceed, but it seems like you were answering the question while you were asking it. It just seemed funny to me.
It's okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Bobineau, does Northwestern follow least cost planning principles for purposes of calculating avoided costs?
When we calculate avoided costs, we look at what cost Northwestern could avoid by acquiring the project at hand. What we would see as a replacement for that project, what we would avoid would be, we would look at for capacity, the least cost capacity resource.
And in Northwestern's 2019 resource plan, did you choose the least cost capacity resource for your calculation?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, your revenue requirement is based on the least cost capacity resource in Northwestern's plan, right?
That's correct.
And the backup fuel alternatives, those were more expensive than the resource fuel you chose, right?
That's correct.
And when you use the least cost resource from Northwestern's plan, that's beneficial to customers, right?
Yes, it is.
No further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Bobineau, you're temporarily excused. Thank you for your testimony.
Sorry, Chairman O'Donnell, may this witness be permanently excused, please?
Is that any objection?
No objection.
Permanently excused. Next witness.
Chairman O'Donnell, Northwestern would call Miss Autumn Mueller, sorry.
Could I ask for a brief moment?
Yes, sir.
Clerk, I don't think we can finish this
Chairman O'Donnell, Northwestern will call Mr. Patrick Powers.
Thank you. Was Mr. Powers sworn in?
No, would you please swear him in?
Mr. Powers, if you would raise your right hand. Promise to, yes, you promise to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mr. Powers, can you please state and spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, Patrick Powers, PATRICK
And who are you employed by?
Northwestern Energy,
What's your title at Northwestern?
Director of Grid Real-Time and SCADA Operations,
How long have you worked for Northwestern?
14 years.
Can you please briefly describe your work experience at Northwestern?
Yeah, I've worked at Northwestern in the Grid Ops Department as an engineer, supervisor, manager, and most recently a director. Our focus is on the operation of the balancing authority, the transmission system, and then CAISO EIM participation.
In response to Northwestern data response 49, KELP represented that it follows the voltage schedule that Northwestern provided it. Has KELP followed the schedule Northwestern provided it?
No, not at all times.
And what does the voltage schedule that Northwestern provided require of KELP?
Northwestern Energy provides a voltage schedule to the KELP facility at the high side point of interconnection with a voltage schedule of 116 kV with a high end tolerance of 119 kV and a low end tolerance of 113.8 kV.
Does Northwestern require all its generators on its system, including KELP, to follow a voltage schedule?
All interconnecting generators greater than 10 megawatts.
And that's including QFs.
That includes QFs.
In response to Northwestern's data request 49, KELP presented data claiming that it demonstrates it operates within a plus or minus 0.90 power factor at the point of interconnection. What did that data actually show?
The data I observed was from the generating unit. It did not show data subject to the point of interconnection. It did not show data that reflected operation near a plus or minus 0.90 power factor.
Do you have an exhibit in front of you up there?
I do.
Do you know what that is?
I do. Is there a specific page you'd like to look at?
At this point, and how do you know what this exhibit is?
Oh, I actually compiled the data and provided this exhibit.
Okay. At this time, I'd like to offer this exhibit as Northwestern Exhibit 4.
Any objections?
No objection.
So ordered.
What does this exhibit show with respect to voltage?
So on the first page, it's actually some language specific to our pro forma GIA language. Section 9.6, and it goes into some details of a synchronous generator, requirements around reactive power. Page 2 is actually a chart. It's a data pull from the point of interconnection for Montana One or the KELP facility. This data is at the point of interconnection. It shows the voltage profile from the dates of March 1st through May 30th. It also shows where the interconnecting voltage goes outside the high end tolerance band of the voltage schedule.
And why is it important for KELP to actually comply with our voltage schedule?
The importance is that we plan the system under the assumption that they will do that. And if we can't operate the system as planned, it can create issues.
And-
As well as not being able to maintain the anticipated voltage at the interconnecting point.
And so this evidence that you're providing in your exhibit is showing that they're not following Northwestern's voltage schedule, right?
Yeah, the evidence presented shows that the voltage goes outside the high end tolerance. And we do not see reactive power response near the 0.90 plus or minus power factor from the KELP facility.
And what does Northwestern have to do to balance its system when kelp exceeds these voltage limits?
So we need to provide reactive power resource in close proximity, which means we either put in shunt devices or we utilize voltage schedule adjustments with interconnecting resources, nearby interconnecting generation resources.
Is there cost associated with that?
Yeah, there's a direct cost associated to that. A power factor is the ratio of real power to apparent power. So if another resource picks up the voltage obligation for control, it would have to potentially reduce its real power output. And as such, a direct cost.
And who pays for those costs?
That cost to be subject to the customer.
So kelp's refusal to follow Northwestern's voltage schedule has caused customers to incur costs.
Correct.
In response to NWE 50, kelp also claimed that Northwestern has never requested to provide reactive power support. Has Northwestern made those requests?
Yes, Northwestern has provided the voltage schedule as well as real-time contact to the KELP facility for additional reactive power support.
Does Northwestern request all generators to provide reactive power support?
All generators greater than 10 megawatts.
And does that include QFs?
That includes QFs.
Has kelp provided Northwestern sufficient reactive power support?
No, not at all times.
Why is it important for kelp to provide sufficient reactive power support?
It's important for KELP as well as all generators to provide the support to maintain the magnetic bonds for the interconnection.
What happens when kelp doesn't provide that support?
When that support's not there, we have to find it from other resources.
Does that increase Northwestern's costs?
Absolutely.
Who pays those costs?
Customer.
So kelp's refusal to provide that reactive power support has caused customers to bear excess costs, right?
Yes.
In response to Northwestern Energy 51, kelp represented that it provided frequency response and provided data that allegedly supports its claim. Has kelp provided sufficient frequency response?
No, not at all times.
Does Northwestern require all generators, including QFs, to provide frequency response?
Per agreement terms, Northwestern Energy requires interconnecting generation resources to have functional governors that are responsive and can sustain output.
Does the data that kelp provided demonstrate that it provides sufficient frequency response?
No, the data I reviewed showed screen captures of what appeared to be plant control systems, but no supporting data that showed actual response to frequency deviation.
What does your exhibit show with respect to reactive power support?
Frequency response or reactive power support?
Oh, sorry, reactive power support. Oh, sorry, frequency response. That's the topic we're on.
So in regards to the data set, we show some sample frequency deviations in the interconnection, and we look specifically at what the KELP facility is doing in response to those frequency deviations to see if their governor is truly controlling and providing real power response or frequency response at the point of interconnection. The data set actually shows charts. If you look on page 5, you would see that the data set shows what we anticipate for governor response, mirrored off a 5% frequency governor droop curve, and then what the actual facility does. The actual facility is depicted in red. The expected response is depicted in green. If you look through these examples, you'll see that there's times where the facility does not provide the expected response, and at times where it doesn't move its response at all, given the frequency deviation.
And what happens when kelp doesn't provide that sufficient frequency response?
So that frequency response is actually bared by interconnecting generation resources throughout the whole interconnection. When Kelp does not do its part, other generating resources through the whole interconnection have to pick that up to help recover the frequency.
Does Northwestern bear expense related to that?
Northwestern, as well as other interconnected utilities and their generation resources.
Do customers have to pay for that extra expense because Kelp won't follow or won't provide sufficient frequency response?
Yes.
And if I didn't ask you already, can you show us what your exhibit shows with respect to reactive power support?
I believe we covered that in earlier questions, but the reactive power support is under the voltage schedule chart, page 2.
Thank you. If Kelp executes Northwestern's LGIA, will it have to follow Northwestern's voltage schedule?
Yes,
Will it have to provide sufficient reactive power support?
yes, within the terms of the agreement.
Will it have to provide a functional operating frequency governor to provide frequency response?
Yes, within the terms of the agreement.
Will Northwestern's customers save money if Kelp is required to follow the terms of Northwestern's LGIA?
Yes,
Will Northwestern's system be more reliable if Kelp is required to follow the terms of Northwestern's LGIA?
yes,
Kelp represented that it would be willing to include sections 9.6 and 11.6 from Northwestern's LGIA into its own proposed LGIA. Can you please explain to the commission why that would not satisfy Northwestern's operational concerns and we would still need the LGIA, our standard form LGIA?
yeah. So Northwestern would look to have a full executed LGIA, just as we do with any other interconnecting generation resource, with agreement to operate to those terms.
It's important for operational
Yes.
concerns, right?
Yes,
Could Northwestern Transmission balance its system if generators were allowed to exceed their capacity ratings by 20%?
no, we'd have a very difficult time if all generating resources were able to exceed their capacity by 20%.
Can you-
Excess energy actually shows itself as inadvertent, which we have to balance against with an ancillary service such as a regulating resource, or it could potentially put the BA outside of what we call a balancing authority ACE limit.
Can you please explain to the commission why it's imperative that generators have fixed limits on the amount of capacity they can transmit onto Northwestern's system?
They have fixed limits so that we can anticipate and study conditions to ensure there's not a transmission related issue, as well as previously described that the balancing authority operates as anticipated to its forecasted load.
And are you aware of Northwestern's transmission line loss studies?
Generally, yes.
Do those studies take into account losses from the generators to the point of interconnection on Northwestern system?
No, not that I'm aware. They focus on the interconnection, the point of interconnection metering.
And so if Northwestern's losses on its transmission system were at 2.8%, would it be inappropriate to assume that the losses from a generator to the point of interconnection would also be 2.8%?
You'd have to make some base assumptions, but I can't state that it would be exactly 2.8%.
Right, because the study isn't focused on the generator to the point of interconnection, right?
Correct, as well as the interconnecting equipment, subject to impedance.
And one last thing, can you please explain to the commission for operational consideration why it's important in order to schedule output from generators?
Yeah, so it's very important to schedule output as well as a resource to meet that schedule, because that's what we plan for, as well as what we anticipate to meet the load demand. When a resource generates above its schedule, it could create two issues, potentially a transmission related issue, transmission overload. It also has the direct impact to the balancing authorities described above. NERC standard BAL 1 sets limits, what are called balancing authority ACE limits. Those are based upon where the frequency is at in the interconnection. And as such, if they over generate, they could push us outside of that balancing authority ACE limit. We actually have 30 minutes to return our ace within that control if it's outside that limit. So operating outside of schedule can directly attribute to exceeding those limits.
And when, if a generator operates outside its schedule, is that harmful to customers?
Yes. There's a direct impact to customers as well as potential impact to regulation and then the compliance regulation that we have under the BAL 1 standard.
And is that true of Kelp's historical exceedance of its 35 megawatt limit?
Kelp's exceedance of that 35 megawatt limit can have direct impact as described, yes.
No further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Brown?
I have no questions.
Mr. Chairman, so Mr. Powers offered live direct testimony, which we did not object to insofar as it related to issues that were raised in our rebuttal testimony. Because he offered live direct testimony, we have not had any opportunity to prepare any cross-examination. Given where we are today, I would request that we defer my cross-examination until tomorrow morning so that I can be as efficient as possible by preparing questions carefully this evening in order not to belabor these proceedings. From my perspective, I have no problem continuing on with Ms. Mueller. And so we don't need to lose the rest of the time, but I would request that we put a pin in Mr. Powers' testimony until tomorrow morning and allow me to do my cross-examination then.
No objection, Your Honor. Oh, so you'll just consult the witness real quick. Sure.
Is that okay? Oh, I do. I can be here tomorrow.
All right, no objection from Northwestern then.
I thought that the agreement on now was that we would have him instead of Ms. Mueller because one would take longer than the other.
Mr. Chairman, the agreement had two nuances. The most important of which is to get Mr. Powers' direct testimony done today, hopefully so then to allow me to prepare more focused cross in the evening so that I could do that tomorrow morning. Now, that direct testimony didn't take very long, so we have a little bit of block of time, but for my purposes, it would be helpful and more efficient, given the unusual nature of live direct testimony, to give me the evening to prepare the cross.
And Northwestern has no objection to that accommodation.
Do all parties anticipate that Ms. Mueller will take less than 24 minutes?
No, she will absolutely take longer, so we can start her, but there's no chance that we finish her testimony this evening. I just wanted to create whatever option the commission preferred in terms of whether to use the remaining time today or simply adjourn today and take up both witnesses tomorrow.
Yeah, and just one more thing for scheduling purposes, I think if we had Ms. Mueller go today, we could finish her up tomorrow and then have Pat go, and then his rebuttal on Pat's would follow that. So it would be a more smooth transition.
That sounds awfully complicated.
At your pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's say that we adjourn now and we had Ms. Mueller tomorrow and the rest of this witness. How long would you expect we have the assurances by Mr. Nelson that we'd be done by noon?
Yeah.
But did I mischaracterize that? You were assured us of that?
Based on the cross I have for Ms. Mueller and what I believe will be fairly limited cross for Mr. Powers and my nearly non-existent cross of the MCC's witness, I think that noon is a reasonable estimate, but I've been wrong before, so please don't take me out and shoot me if I'm wrong.
So let's do this. 4:38, 20 minutes to 5. Let's adjourn until, would it be 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? I mean, can we do it from 9 to 12?
At your pleasure. I believe so, yes.
Sir?
Sorry, one more just for the sake of saving time tomorrow too. I think Commissioner Pernocchi maybe just suggested that everyone else does their cross first, and if they have any, and that way we can just get that part done.
I'd rather adjourn now.
Okay.
Okay, so we're adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you, off the record now.